Hello, I'm Carla Herrera, host and producer of this podcast. Choices podcast came to be because it's always called my attention how every choice we make in life, even the small ones, can have a surprising effect on our lives. Every choice we make outcome or result in a consequence, and it's up to us, and what really makes us is the way we react to those results and what we do about them. Today I have a very special guest. I started this podcast 27 episodes ago, and it's always been in my mother language in Spanish. We're doing it in English today, and I hope it's the first of many. I'll figure out how to put subtitles so that everybody can understand if needed later on in the other platforms. But this special guest has a very important and even vital message and story to tell. I welcome Madison Campbell to this space and hope as always that she may inspire us and that we all learn from what she's come here to share. Megan, it's lovely to have you, and I'm honored to have a guest like you. I feel that you're extremely brave, and this business project endeavor of yours, which is amazing, because from a super dark experience, you're bringing support, light, and love to a huge group of victims. So please talk to us a little bit about Leda Health, how it came to be in yourself.
Hey everyone, I was a sexual assault survivor back in college. Mine was my junior year of college. I did not seek medical care or therapeutic care. And that's kind of what made me, become the person I am today, and the reason why I'm now running this company as well. And so, I think it's really important for survivors to speak up and talk about what happened to them. I certainly didn't speak up and talk about what happened to me afterwards, but it wasn't only my story. It was the story of, thousands of other young women and men who've all experienced sexual assault and are all just trying to make it through, the day. And so I think that that's kind of where it comes from in terms of Leda.
And how do you come to the name Leda, and when from the assault, when the assault happened to that you decided to create Leda and I don't know, found the strength within you to speak up?
Yeah, of course. So the name comes from the Greek mythology story Leda and the Swan. And so in the story Leda and the Swan, Leda was actually sexually assaulted by Zeus. And so we wanted to kind of have this story that had a name behind it that really meant something. Because oftentimes you can't speak to anybody about your assault, but oftentimes you feel like you can speak to somebody who was also a sexual assault survivor. And so Leda is that type of person, right? Leda is the person who was sexually assaulted, who understands you, and that's, who we are at Leda as well. We always say we're a company built by survivors for survivors, and that is really true because, we all have our stories, whether it's our story or the story of someone who we really love, and those are the stories that we're trying to inspire.
No, absolutely. I'm very curious as to know who Madison was going to be pre the assault. I mean, you were in college, you were studying maybe something completely different, and you had projects for your life. What were you going to do before? How everything changed?
So I thought I was going to go into epidemiology. So I was studying epidemiology at University of Edinburgh, and I was going to school in America as well. But when my sexual assault happened is when I was at University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And, that was the person who I wanted to be. I really wanted to be an epi. I wanted to work for the CDC or the World Health Organization. But, honestly, I feel like what I'm doing now is a health epidemic as well. I think it's something that we don't talk about as much as COVID, but it is something that impacts thousands of people. And so I do think in a way it kind of aligns with what I wanted to do. I just didn't know that this would be my passion until something happened to me.
No, agreed. I mean, those are the type of things that are game changers, life changers. And the good thing, and as I was saying in the intro, right? I mean, lots of things happen to us and it's the way we react to them. This wasn't really a choice, but it was definitely something that occurred and you took off from there. You know how it's horrible, but I was posting that we were going to have this interview. And I was saying, maybe we have to have tools. Maybe we have to know more about self-defense. It's awful to think that, you have to prepare yourself pre-assault, thinking that it could happen and prepare your kids, your daughters because it's like, and then somebody responded, are we going to say it's the fault of the abused and not the perpetrator? And I'm like, absolutely not. It's obviously the perpetrator is the bad guy in this whole story. But at the end of the day, you know, once the abuse has been done, the damage is done. Is there anything that you now, after the fact, think that should be, you know, learned as a way to avoid, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was less about what happened to me necessarily, because when it was happening to me, it was not, I was not drunk, I was not drinking, I, you know, didn't have any drugs or anything. I wasn't out that night. But unfortunately, you know, the person who did this to me was severely drinking, was very, very drunk, and had no understanding kind of like those boundaries or consent. And so if I think about things I would have done differently, like there wasn't that much that I could have done, but I really do think that there has to be, you know, really like a preventative effort, you know, primarily on all genders, really teaching about consent, and also really teaching about the fact that, you know, when you are intoxicated, it is very difficult to give consent. It's very difficult to understand those boundaries. And I think that that was kind of, you know, the big thing for me, is that there were boundaries that that were crossed, and those boundaries, you know, I knew the person, right? 80% of survivors know the person who they were assaulted by. And, you know, during the day when he was sober, he was a perfectly fine, very nice gentleman. And I think it was, you know, those boundaries were crossed because oftentimes, you know, it can be very difficult to understand that under intense intoxication. And so, you know, I really think there has to be some education there to really understand, you know, what those boundaries are and why it can be very difficult to make decisions, you know, if you're extremely intoxicated, or something like that.
Yeah, and that's taking into account that they are intoxicated, because I was also reading in your page, there's so much information, but like we were talking about, what's it called? The hot season. And I would have thought that we would still be in the hot season until the holidays, and then maybe that spring would be another hot season, which is when most of the assaults occur. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's actually called like the red zone, but yeah, I kind of like the hot season too. It's hilarious. But the red zone is, you know, the likelihood where folks are more likely to be sexually assaulted, and it coincides with events oftentimes that have a lot of partying or drinking, like folks going to college for the first time, not knowing, you know, oh, this party's going to act like this, or this is, you know, what's going to happen here, what's going to happen there. They're away from their parents for the first time. And so all of those things, you know, kind of coincide together to create something called the red zone, where you are statistically more likely to be sexually assaulted. And so it's during those times where I believe strict, you know, education and prevention work is incredibly important. Not only telling people that there's a higher chance of this happening during this time, but also that it isn't your fault. You know, no one knows what to expect, especially if you came from a very, you know, small conservative, you know, upbringing like I did. In going to one of these parties or going into a big, you know, college or university, and not understanding that things might be very different than the hometown that you grew up in.
No, that's awful. And then thinking, you know, I should be with a friend, or when I go back home, I should avoid empty streets. But it's at the end of the day living in a bit of a paranoia that shouldn't kind of have to get to that. Another of the big numbers that shocked me was that every 68 seconds, somebody's assaulted, and only 25 out of 1,000, you know, perpetrators actually end up in jail. I mean, the numbers are completely outrageous. Why do you think that happens?
I mean, I think it comes back to, you know, the top of kind of the funnel, where people don't want to talk about their sexual assault. They don't want to get care. And obviously the criminal justice system internationally is really hard to get convictions, or to get justice for sexual assault. But at the forefront of it, I think, you know, it comes back to the fact that the majority of people will never report their sexual assault. And so if you have less people reporting, you have, you know, less cases, and you have less cases actually, you know, moving forward into what would be perceived as justice for some people. And so I really think that, you know, a world in which we are encouraged to talk about it, we're not ashamed to talk about it. We're not going to judge you on the basis of what were you wearing or what were you drinking or, you know, who were you with the night before, but instead really believing survivors is incredibly important.
No, it's completely got to do that as well. It's crazy, but it's manners. It's a bit what you're saying. I mean, people should have like inner decency and manners to not act in that way. You're talking about it being hard to speak about, and I completely agree. I mean, when I was approached, I was like, "Oh, this is a really iffy subject. You know, it's going to be really tough to talk about," because at the end of the day, you don't talk about it like when you're talking about other things that are much easier to talk about, right? But it was a huge stepping stone with Alicia, and I didn't know it was Alicia Milano or the Me Too. Obviously, I've heard Me Too. Everybody has nowadays, and this happened in 2017. And it's been huge, I think, to create awareness on this subject.
No, I completely agree. And I think language in general is incredibly important to talk about the subject. So it's not just you know, the Me Too movement, but, you know, oftentimes we think about like the notion of domestic violence, right? Domestic violence was for a long time not called domestic violence. It was just called what husbands and wives did to each other, right? Like your husband could beat you, they could slap you. That was something that was normal, you know, long time ago, until we got language to describe it. Even with sexual assault, you know, like and all these words that we kind of come up with, those are the things that we really need to think about in terms of like the language and the movements and, you know, how we talk about it is so important because it allows people to come forward. And I don't think I would have come forward had it not been for the Me Too movement. So it was incredibly important to me as well.
No, and it was a complete game changer. So then you come forward, and how do you recruit a group of people to start preparing what LEDA is today? Because LEDA it's got a huge spectrum. I mean, it gives a wide range of help, which we'll talk about with kind of professionals. But then it's also created this kit.
Yeah, so, you know, what we think about when we build products is the fact that there's not just one solution or one thing in the toolbox that is good for every survivor. In fact, you want to empower survivors to have as much ammo, right, in their arsenal in order to kind of say, oh, I need this. Okay, we have this. I need this. I have that. And so, you know, one of the things we are adding into our lineup is doing toxicology because, you know, oftentimes GHB, ketamine, or rohypnol can be used in order to sexually assault someone. So now folks have the opportunity to find out if they were drugged, right? And that's an incredibly important piece of information that they can take in order to make, you know, decisions in the future about whether or not they want to move forward with a case. Past just doing toxicology, we do, you know, STI screening, right? Because unplanned STIs or unplanned pregnancies can all be things that can happen due to a sexual assault. And so can we provide, you know, help for those people? That's, you know, something we really believe in doing at LEDA. And then I think one of the more novel things that we're doing is something called an early evidence kit, which has been done in places like Australia and the UK, which basically allows survivors as close to the event as humanly possible to collect evidence after they've been sexually assaulted in order to look at that evidence and determine whether or not there was another party involved and who that party was and be able to show that in a very quick and efficient way.
So, but this kit is something that you would have in handy or something that you'd have to go to the nurse at the university to collect, or how would you go about this?
Yeah, the goal would be for wherever you are, if you're at a university or if you're at home or wherever, there's a very easy way for you to get it, whether that is through delivery, which we do. So being able to get it delivered in under 2 hours, past just delivery, having it available in a safe location, like, you know, within a specific area of your institution that you can get at any hours of the day, no questions asked, really increasing that accessibility by allowing people to say, hey, you know, I'm looking for this, I need it now, and I need it in a discreet and anonymous way.
Yeah, it's a bit like Planned Parenthood when, you know, people wanted to access the after day pill and it was, you know, yes, there was that, it was frowned upon. And so you really needed that privacy to be able to feel comfortable to do it or have access to it even.
Exactly.
So this is hopefully something that's going to be in every university in the States. But after this, because it all sounds great, but what you're saying, the system, the judicial system, is so complicated. Sometimes they won't even accept, kids that come from hospitals. So in a way, how do you reassure a victim? Because I know that all changes within states.
Yeah, I mean, every case is going to be different, right? And so I think it's really important to educate survivors and understand that, every case is very, very different. That is going to come up to a judge. It's going to come up to the different facts in a specific trial. And getting that information is very hard, right? As a survivor, I had no idea just how complicated the legal system was to navigate as, even as a survivor in that moment. But now I'm still learning things on a day-to-day basis about how difficult it is to navigate. And so this comes back to the education piece. When I go and speak to students, oftentimes I find that a lot of them were never taught what to even do after an assault, let alone how complicated the judicial system would be, right? I think we generally know if there's an emergency, call 911, but that's kind of where our emergency education stops. And so what I think is really, really important is that we continue that education. And if we continued it from a very young age about this is, how our judicial system works. This is how these things operate. If you want to go forward with this, this is how it's going to work. I think all those things are really empowering to survivors and acknowledging the fact that they can make their own decisions, right? Survivors are very strong. We have a lot of autonomy. We want to be held to the same standard as any other medical patient, and then inform them of their rights and inform them of the options that they have.
No, and it's brutal because you were saying as well, no, when it goes via the police, a lot of times you're being asked so many questions, even it's not even a hazard, being like you're feeling assaulted by the person that's supposed to be helping you in a way. So it just gets that much more complicated. But at least having the tools to start understanding how you could come about it is huge. When a survivor contacts LIDA, there's different professionals that come to help, right? You have nurses, you have the forensic evidence. Tell me a little bit about those.
Yeah, and I want to go back to what you were saying in terms of, the process can feel very difficult or alarming. I mean, I certainly can only speak from my experience. And, it was the fear that it would be, too intrusive, which was the reason why I did not want to go. And I have heard stories of other survivors tell the stories of being in a hospital and feeling like there were questions that they didn't feel comfortable, answering yet. And that can be very difficult in the moments after an assault. And so, I think one of the biggest things that we've tried to build at LIDA is a very holistic team to basically say, look, we have a large group of professionals that come from very different angles, whether it's a prosecutor, forensic nurse, a serologist that works in a laboratory in order to show you your lab results, a clinical manager, right? Being able to get every single kind of person on the front end to say, here's what we know from our 20 plus years experience. This is what we know. We want to help survivors, and here are your rights. And I think that it takes a long time to build something out like that, and to understand that by building something out like that, right, it really allows you to be able to offer a holistic system for survivors, because they don't oftentimes just need the one person, they need the group of people, professionals that are there for them.
But LIDA, has it got a physical place? Is it the objective to have physical places everywhere, or is this mostly done online?
Right now we're all online, so we're very virtual. You can kind of tell that we were started in COVID. When virtual was kind of the name of the game in order to create ability. But I do see in the future an opportunity for us to be in certain locations and to be able to offer that help. And I think it is something that is incredibly powerful. Obviously, we're always telling people to go and seek in-person care when they can, but we acknowledge the fact that not all folks might feel comfortable doing that. And so, I certainly didn't. I know many survivors that did not as well. And I think the biggest thing that we want to do is encourage all survivors to seek as
There was a huge, I found it super interesting when I saw that you mentioned dating apps, because at the end of the day, a lot of this is education, and the world has shifted so much. I mean, everything's become virtual. I'm married, and back in my time, there was no dating apps, so I didn't ever meet anybody via whatever all these things are called. There's a huge
Yeah.
danger in that. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's been some studies, and we kind of talk about it a little bit on our Instagram about some of, the dangers. But oftentimes, I think that's with anything, right? Like going to a bar and meeting someone, maybe not having your drink covered, something can happen there. I know that I think where a lot of the stuff comes down to is boundaries and consent is not always discussed. And so, I think people can get the wrong idea, unfortunately, which is not that great, then go out expecting something to happen, and maybe it doesn't happen. And that's kind of where that behavior can come from. And so I think really, really what is the most important in terms of, kind of the dating app world is to understand that, when you're talking to these folks, they are strangers, you haven't met them yet. You haven't probably had a discussion around consent or boundaries, but even having that discussion before you meet them is incredibly important, because that can at least set the standard of saying, hey, like, I'm happy to go to dinner with you, but please don't expect that, I'm going to go home with you after dinner. I just would like to do this. Because oftentimes it can be kind of misread communication, and that can be really harmful to potential folks, no matter if it ends in a sexual assault or just feeling a little bit uncomfortable.
No, definitely. I found it very interesting at the very beginning of us talking. You were saying the guy that assaulted me, I knew perfectly well, and he was a very nice guy in the daytime. So I mean, it was that. Do you think that a lot of victims feel sorry for the nice guy in the daytime, and then they decide not to prosecute? I mean, there's a little bit, I assume, of what's it called, when you're kidnapped, the syndrome where you Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of generally not so great things have happened to me in relationships throughout my life, and I have not reported any of them. I, went through something that I would consider psychological abuse in terms of a relationship. I did not, move forward with talking about that. Obviously, I've gone through a sexual assault and just various, other things that have happened to me. And, it is very interesting that afterwards I usually do think about the fact that, these are people with jobs and careers that I don't want to stop them, from having to go through, whatever they want to accomplish in life. I believe that that's incredibly important. I think the thing that gets really complicated with it is knowing, because the statistic is oftentimes someone who sexually assaults someone will sexually assault multiple people, right? It's not just you. And I think it gets really difficult to think about that, because sometimes you can think, okay, well, maybe I'm not going to say anything, but if by not saying something, does that hurt, X, Y, Z people? And so, encouraging people to speak up, encouraging people to talk, even if it's confidentially, filing a report without your name as a Jane Doe, I think is very important, not even necessarily because of you, but because you might be protecting, someone else in the future.
And I have to completely agree with you on that one. It's making me remember a story that was back in Spain, and I think it was a guy in a building, and he was actually sexually abusing kids. And of course, or teenagers, nobody wanted to speak up about it. And what they did by not speaking up is that it became an issue for, more than 5 kids in the building. And that's where the problem starts, right? Because many times it's a facade of a person that you see, and it's something completely different in the background. So yes, that's a huge, huge issue. There was you were talking about there being many more women than men, but still it must be hard for the few men that there are.
100%. And, those people are even highly stigmatized, right? To not speaking up because of, how could a guy get assaulted, right? Like that's oftentimes what people will say. And of course that is 100% not true. Men can get assaulted just as easily as women can get assaulted. And I think it just is a very difficult thing that we have not created language or communication around, especially, within, I would say, like middle to high school, right? Like where I think a lot of this really needs to start around consent and education and what to do in relationships and how to have a healthy relationship really needs to start a lot younger than we're starting these discussions, which often happen into adulthood. But I mean, I don't know if you remember like your high school sex ed class. Mine was kind of a joke, but like, it was very abstinence based, right? And
Yes.
so while it's very lovely, to think about, abstinence based
until you
training,
until you marry and have kids.
really,
This is just to have kids.
yeah, exactly. I just don't think it's very realistic, about what happens in the world. And by kind of doing, that education on abstinence only, it can be very harmful because then when something happens to them, I think it's at an added level, right? Because if you grow up religious too, and you do believe in the whole sex before marriage and then you're sexually assaulted, that can be very difficult because, not only did you break this thing that you thought you were supposed to follow, but now you kind of feel like, oh my God, was this my fault, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Let's go on to, because you're mentioning, how these things make you feel. The PTSD.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's something that never leaves you. I think it's just kind of how you make it part of your story or not part of your story, and where that, where that kind of comes up. I think one of the things that I struggle with is how my relationships are, like having a healthy relationship, having a healthy sex life, with my significant other, is oftentimes probably a little bit more difficult than it is for someone who hasn't kind of gone through trauma. And so that PTSD shows up in different ways. It's not just, oh, I'm having nightmares or I'm having anxiety. Yes, I have anxiety. Sometimes I have nightmares. Sometimes I have memories that I don't want to talk about anymore. But it also shows up in different ways, which is how do we have a healthy relationship and how do you have, a healthy sex life as well that doesn't feel like it is sexual assault or non-consensual or remind you of something bad that might have happened to you.
At the end of the day, it's tough, right? Because you have all that PTSD to live with, and also there's the in a lot of cases it's the person, the victim, that actually wants to see or grab on to blaming themselves. Was I wearing something inappropriate? Did I give the wrong signs? And how do you come to divide that? Where is the, because there's a lot of, she was asking for it, she really wanted, I mean, she was saying no, but it was a yes. How do you manage all that, or how do you explain those things in Lita?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things like that I think about is, so the night my sexual assault happened, the person in question, he was out drinking, he was at a bar, he was trying to pick up women that night, and kind of struck out,
Mm-hmm.
right? And this is a person with, and so what do you say to someone who's like, trying to go home with someone, trying to, meet someone? You say, oh my God, yeah, I'm so sorry that happened to you, but you're a really great guy. And even though it didn't happen tonight, hopefully in the future, you'll be able to find somebody and they'll love you because you're super great and you're super kind and considerate. And, what I didn't realize, and this is how I thought about it, it's not how I think about it now, but how I thought about it in the moment was, by saying that, by saying, oh, there's a girl out there for you, she's going to fall in love with you, she's going to do this, X, Y, Z, I didn't realize that I was almost, this is how I thought about it, inviting him to see me as that person,
Right.
right? So I'm like, but of course, yes, it's how he viewed it in his, alcoholic state. But that wasn't the case, right? It's not my fault. I was trying to be a good friend. I was trying to say to him, yes, this is something that happens, but, we're here for you. There is someone out there. But unfortunately that, quote unquote, invited the bad behavior. And so, the next day I thought about like those text messages and I was like, was I leading him on
Right.
by saying that,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think it's taken me many years to realize, of course, that wasn't my fault. That is what you do, and that's how you talk to
Right.
people in order to make sure that they're, okay, because everyone deserves love and everyone deserves care. and I want to hope, I haven't talked to him since that happened, but I want to hope that he was able to realize what happened. He was able to hopefully never do that again. And I still want love for him, and I still hope he finds love. I don't think that he's not deserving of that, but I do, hope that he came to realize and understand that, his behavior that night was not what anybody would have wanted, especially somebody who, you might be saying, oh, this might be the girl for me.
But ultimately, at the end of the day, you, as a victim, and I assume a lot of victims look for, are consequences. I mean, this guy should have had consequences. Is it about that? I mean, is that why we're creating a kit and all these tools for somebody to be able to have, as you said, the MO that if they want to pursue a legal case, that they have? How do we react to that?
I think consequences are hard to reconcile because I think it changes over your life about whether, like, what you want, right? Like, in the moment afterwards, you could be like, I want this, right? And then in a couple months later, you're like, I want this. And so I think the thing that I want to give people is information and opportunity so that they can go through all of those ups and downs and then have every option available for them to move forward with whatever they want. So, I personally don't think I need to see the person who sexually assaulted me in jail.
Right.
I love for him to understand what he did to me and hopefully not do that to anyone else. And I think that that's my form of healing. Of course, I'll never find that out probably, but I hope it's the case. But I think it's 100% fair too for other folks who want different opportunities in order to move forward with whatever justice is for them. But oftentimes, when it comes to 5 years, 10 years down the line, and you don't have, text messages or evidence or your toxicology report, it can be very hard to kind of seek that. And so I think that that's kind of what we're trying to do is give a survivor every opportunity. And it can be a moment of time. You might not feel like you want to do anything yet, but give them that time. And in that time, it could be years later, they can then determine what they want to do moving forward.
No, and actually the Me Too movement showed us, right, that it can happen many years after that you get the justice for this. So it doesn't have to be instantaneous, basically, which I think is amazing. And that's what was huge, right? A lot of people must have thought, oh, I got away with it. And now they're thinking maybe I didn't, which is at least comforting. We were initially looking at this because obviously a lot of the viewers in this community are from Honduras. We're talking about a country with, little resources, and where this type of assault happens, I mean, exponentially, I would say, like, it's crazy. How do you think getting Lida and the kids into Honduras, into a country like this, which, I mean, honestly, it would have to go initially via government, and then maybe they would, give access to hospitals or even schools. But it's just, there's so many needs that this would be, like the cherry on the top of the cake, maybe, the last thing in the closet. How do you feel that it can make a difference in these countries?
Oh, I think 100% it can make a difference. And we already know this from starting to do work in Ukraine. So we actually started to bring these kids over to Ukraine during, obviously, the Ukrainian war right now, which is very terrible in terms of a lot of sexual assault that's happening. And so, that stuff has to happen in collaboration with the government, which is really sad, that it has to kind of start there. Mm-hmm. But even if local governments are willing to step up, if they're willing to say, hey, this is something that I really want to do, this is an impact that I really want to make, I could see so much opportunity, right? So it's not only in, countries that are currently experiencing a very bad war, but it's in countries that don't have that many resources, because this is a cost-effective way of actually collecting and preserving evidence and hopefully, holding folks to a standard of justice. But, what it's really going to take is strong folks and strong advocates advocating for change in the countries where they're at.
It's so complicated because even you're mentioning the war in Ukraine. I mean, also chaos invites for that type of assault to happen, because I think that people think, or, perpetrators think they can get away with it much easier, which is one of the huge problems, right? I do agree with you about the advocates. I think you have to have a really strong team behind it. And I think that it could really start to happen. So I see Lita going in that way, and I think it's fabulous that you're moving forward with that type of project. Well, this at the end of the day, this podcast is called Choices, right? About our choices in life. And I always like to come to an end kind of asking, is there any moment that you made a choice in your life that you, in a way, maybe would have been better living without, or that you actually did? You went into it and said, this is not for me, I'm going to come out of it. Is there that one thing or that choice that just didn't work for you and you would have gone back on?
I'm a big believer in, I think everything kind of happens for a reason. And so I think it's a really hard thing to reconcile when bad things have happened generally in a lot of people's lives, mine included, as I'm sure yours included. But, I think every piece of information, every story, everything that I am today happened because of the events, right? Had I not been sexually assaulted, would I have started this company? I'm not sure, right? Would I have loved to have no trauma in my life? Of course, and I'm sure I would have done something else that was really great. But it happened to me, and I'm taking that and I'm moving forward with it, and I think it's really important. And so, I wish I could say I would go back and do something differently. But honestly, I'm very proud of the person I am today. I'm very proud of the people that I have around me, supporting me and spreading this mission. And I think that that's the most important part, even though there has been a lot of things that, had I done differently, had I been a little bit more careful, maybe wouldn't have happened. But that wouldn't also be the same Madison that you're talking to right now.
Right, Madison. Do you think that you're talking about your network of support, which I think is super big, like important, but do you think that a lot of times it's your own family that scares victims, like how they are going to react?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I didn't tell my family for a long time. Actually, I was not the one to tell my family. An ex-boyfriend of mine was the one that told my mother. So I didn't even get the chance to tell my mother it happened to me. My ex-boyfriend, when I was leaving him, told my mother, "Hey, your daughter had been sexually assaulted." Eventually the information was going to come out, but that's kind of how it came out. And I think it was a really scary thing for me. I think it was scary because I think I generally like to protect people from information that I think will make them sad.
Right.
And I don't think I thought that my parents would be mad at me. I think that they were just going to be very sad because, they were in America, I was in Scotland, and there was not physically anything that they could have done to make it better. And oftentimes that's kind of how it is. No matter how much parents want to make things better, sometimes they can't, right?
Right. No, and as a parent nowadays, it's become so complicated. I remember we used to go, sleepovers before, and it was way more common. And nowadays, very few people do that because you've heard of so many stories, like even in childhood, that there is so many dangers, and it's the closest people to you, and so I think that we live a bit in that. I wouldn't call it paranoia, but definitely, we're way more careful about like the things we do.
I think about that all the time. I don't have kids yet, but I think about, when I do have kids, like what I'm going to educate them on and what I'm going to protect them on, knowing what I know about the world. And I think about our generation where, of course, I went to sleepovers where there was like the brother and the dad and like, the family members over. And now knowing everything I know, I'd be like, holy moly, no. I want to believe the best in people, but I think it's really, really hard. So maybe I'll become a helicopter mom like my mom was a helicopter mom.
So statistics are really frightening. I mean, scary. Last question, Madison. What is the best choice of your life to this day? What would you consider that, choice that you say, I'm so happy I did do?
Starting this company for sure has been the best choice that I've made. It has led me into friendships. It has led me into, building myself up in areas that I never thought I would, have the capacity to. And I think it's been very challenging. There's been a lot of very challenging things that we go through, and I continue to go through, and our team continues to go through. But every single moment of that is worthwhile because I think, you know, we do have the opportunity to change so many people's lives.
Do you think that government-wise and like in the US, they're helping you to get out there, or there's still a lot of red tape?
I think it's going to take a long time for culture to change around sexual assault. And I think the slowest culture changes in the government is basically what I'll say on that topic. You know, in terms of even codifying, you know, LGBTQ marriages, which only happened like this past couple weeks, right? And so it is 2022, right? We've been fighting this fight for a long time. Obviously, the culture needs to change, but it also needs to be codified and needs to be supported by the government, which can just take a long time.
Bueno, pues I'm encouraging you in your fight. I think you're doing something great. As I said, I think you're bringing a lot of light into a really dark topic, and I think it's great that you're getting more people and more victims to join you in this crusade, let's call it. It was lovely having you. I know that you're traveling, I think in Rome or something, and connection at the end worked fine because European connection can be a bit iffy. So I thank you so much for joining me, and it's been a great talk.
Great talk to you as well. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Madison. So that was it. We had Madison Campbell today. It was a fantastic talk. We're really eye-opening, and I think that very motivating for a lot of people out there to know that, you know, there are more victims in the world, and that they're getting the strength to speak up, and that it doesn't determine your life, and it definitely doesn't have to determine the way you live it. I think it was very inspiring. I always say that I hope that we are inspired, that we learn, you know, that it's a learning experience, and that we're entertained. I didn't actually say that in my intro because I felt like it was a bit, you know, it was just crazy to call entertainment to this type of talk. But I think that what Madison showed us today is that this can be talked about in a very natural way without being scared, to talk about it and to address it. And I wouldn't say entertained, but it's definitely been super interesting and great to listen to and even watch if there's any watchers. I'm going to be editing all this info, so we cut off the parts at the beginning that were cut off, and you can listen to it in podcasts, in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and even YouTube. I'll be uploading it, hopefully finding an application that translates all this into Spanish. As I said, this has been my first Spanish interview. It's been great having first English interview. I'm going to translate it into subtitles in Spanish. I hope it's the first of many. I think there's a lot of people there that, you know, need to have access to this podcast, and if they're English speakers, well, as they've been able to see today, they're more than welcome. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I love these talks that I have, this podcast, this space that I have once a week, and I'm just hoping you join me next week. We're going to have a person here from Miami. She's an expert in what to do with kids in the area, and it's going to be very interesting for this Christmas because, you know, the festivities are coming up, and she has all the knows. So join me for that one. It's going to be great. Thanks for being with me today. Have a good weekend.